Call of Duty is a game series that's always been very special to me. I can totally identify why, but in recent years it's becoming harder and harder for me to say I'm an actual fan of these games anymore. Make no mistake, I still play most entries which come out, excluding the ones that I already know are going to be bad. But ever since I suppose Black Ops 2, there's always been certain elements of each individual release which are lacking for me personally. Taking a look back at the last 3 releases before Modern Warfare 2, we had Vanguard, which was an utter mess from start to finish, Cold War, which is the exemption here due to the fact I think it was a genuinely well-made game across the board, and then Modern Warfare 2019, which basically rebooted the entire franchise. That might be a perfect example for how I perceived COD for years at this point. The campaign I thought was fantastic. The multiplayer took a slower and more considered approach to the fast-paced combat the series was known for, something which I enjoyed on the whole, but still had issues within certain aspects. I'm aware some people despise this brand new approach, and once again I understand why. The gunplay may have been tight, the graphics may have been astonishing, but when you're getting sniped across maps from a guy sitting in a dark room, or simply walking around and getting taken out by someone sitting in a corner, that can get very frustrating, and is worsened by the fact the game actively encouraged this kind of approach. I find it fascinating going back just a bit further than Modern Warfare though, as it showed the series arguably at its most lost and confused. Black Ops 4 was another complete mess, heavily chasing after the Battle Royale craze with its Blackout mode, and noticeably having other elements significantly hampered as a result. I thought Blackout was great, and personally see the Warzone we have now as an active regression on what was presented in that mode. But Black Ops 4 is an undeniably flawed game due to how each game mode was not treated with an equal amount of care. Just look at the Zombies mode in that game, the budgetary issues become so blatant towards the end. Point is, COD is a franchise that will always be quality in my eyes, but they've always had their shortcomings. I can understand why someone who's not into these games would perceive them as being the same thing every single year. I mean, the yearly release model in itself could make someone assume that right off the bat. And looking at the gameplay doesn't particularly help either. Up until Modern Warfare once again, the only difference that could really be felt is the environment you're shooting in and the weapons you're using. These are all observations I've made from playing these games at a prolonged length over the course of my entire life. And despite the repetition, I have no idea how people can write these games off as anything but quality. The gunplay is always stellar, the graphics are always cutting edge, and some of the stories here, although being fairly blatant and not all that insightful, are incredibly gripping at points, with characters and storylines which are nothing less than iconic.
I know you understand.
So, coming into Modern Warfare 2, this being the second part of this brand new reboot of the Modern Warfare series, I admittedly had fairly high expectations. Coming off the travesty which was Sledgehammer's Vanguard, there's an inevitable stamp of quality that comes with Infinity Ward for me. Even their releases that were received with utter disdain, such as Infinite Warfare, were technically solid and relatively good in my opinion, especially the campaign. But during the initial beta at least, I had slight concerns. On the whole, everything seemed up to par and about what I expected, but there were some changes and lack of changes that particularly stood out to me, which we'll talk about in a sec. But first, let's start off with the campaign, as this time round I feel the sheer effort that's clearly gone into it deserves recognition. And, in case you'd forgotten, there was a time where COD games weren't simply being made as multiplayer-focused cash cows. Picking up where the last game left off, we've got all the iconic characters which we've known throughout the years, such as Captain Price, Gaz, and this time the introduction of 2 others, those being Soap and Ghost.
Fucking hell.
These aren't the only characters which are brought back in a slightly different form, however, as we can see from the opening mission Strike. Much like Modern Warfare 2019, which I'll now be simply referring to as 2019, this opening is simply an introduction, not even particularly to the game's events, but the types of operations that we'll be embarking on throughout our journey. Starting with one of many comparisons I'll be making to 2019. Whereas I think this intro is still fantastic, I don't think I like it anywhere near as much as that game's opening. We'll get into how this game handles its social commentary later on, but even despite how ham-fisted a lot of 2019's commentary was, it still starts the game with a solid impact. For me, it felt like a slight return to the genuinely daring events which we saw in the past games. Of course, with the main thing that comes to people's minds being the mission No Russian from the first Modern Warfare 2. People have criticised No Russian to no end by this point, but I still think it works pretty effectively from the shock factor at least. You're not going around blowing the heads off puppies or kittens or anything, but it's still a mission that is undeniably striking, and does a great job in setting the real stakes of that game. 2019 goes the approach of showing the sheer reality of these terrorist organisations, whereas here, much like the rest of the game, it's more focused on both our tight-knit set of characters, as well as the sheer intensity of the events which eventually play out. That's something which is set right from the get-go, and leads to what I consider to be a problem in both of these remakes. The original Modern Warfare was rather low-key in a lot of aspects. It eventually falls into a typical life or death mission, but during the opening hours, and especially during missions like All Gillied Up, a mission which still remains one of the greatest scenarios in gaming history for me, there's a sense that even though we're dealing with these severe situations, as Price says, it's just another day at the office.
Government loyalists against ultranationalist rebels, and 15,000 nukes at stake. Just another day at the office.
Fast forward to the first MW2, and we've gone grandiose in every aspect imaginable. Bursting into prisons to rescue targets, getting a whole army tailing us in the favelas, and then having a genuine showdown by the end of it. It's two different approaches, both of which work for their respective games. And that's the worrying thing about these two remakes. They're concerningly unoriginal. 2019 tries to exactly mirror the low-key nature of the first one, which can be seen most blatantly in missions like Clean House. Still great, of course. Clean House is definitely a series highlight, but there's an unoriginality plaguing these remakes which I can't fully get on board with. And that applies to this new game too. Just from the opening mission, you can see how they're now emulating the grandiosity of the second game. It might not be an issue for many, you might see it as a nitpick, but there's something which trivializes the experience for me in that scenario. Although it might not be exactly the same content-wise, purposely trying to recapture a tone which has already been done before is worrying from a wider viewpoint for me. I'll elaborate more on that later though. As I was saying, we're also introduced to pre-existing characters like Shepard and Laswell, while also hearing the character Graves. The characters are one of the best things this campaign gets right. As we'll see, it both fleshes out characters that were desperately requiring more development from 2019, while at the same time having these new characters be well-rounded and solely identifiable within the relatively short running time here. All we do for the first one is take control of Ghost, the only time we actually get to play as him for the entirety of the game, which was slightly disappointing to be honest considering how insanely cool of a character he is, and simply observe an arms deal before blowing everyone to high heaven. Not much to see in a gameplay sense, but the thing it does do is both set the tone and also the stakes for the game by taking out General Gabrani. Taking into account some of the upcoming missions, we can also plausibly say it's setting the player up for a more considered approach to their encounters too. We don't actually do any shooting here, but observing enemies from a distance and marking which targets you'll take out first is definitely something we'll see later on. From the cutscenes which play before, during, and after this one, we also have to realise this is one of the best looking games ever made up to this point. Although the raw gameplay may not look quite as lifelike as the cutscenes here, that's purely because the bar set from these cutscenes is so ridiculously high that it's nigh on impossible. Let's just focus on the graphics for a while, as they really do deserve all the praise I can possibly throw at them. Starting with the cutscenes, not only are these some of the most fantastically directed moments in the entire franchise, making a clear movement towards fully animated sequences as opposed to the older game's slideshow type style, but I'm sorry, there are several times I was utterly tricked into thinking they'd actually injected live action segments into these. I don't say that lightly either. I'm definitely not one to go above and beyond on pre-rendered cutscenes, as they're used far too often in marketing to show off a game's graphics, when realistically a game doesn't look anything like the cutscenes paint out. Honestly though, because of elements like the direction, the lighting, and just the sheer fidelity of every texture here, they skirt over the line of the uncanny valley and just go into the realms of pure realism. I've experienced this kind of feeling before, but arguably never to the degree I did here. What I think they've tapped into with these games is something I've wanted from so many recent releases which wear their graphical fidelity on their sleeves. It's all good having these 4K high resolution textures, but if there's any kind of movement or physics-based actions which look unrealistic in any fashion, it runs the risk of potentially sucking me right out of the experience. I feel like the fluidity of movement, particularly in characters' actions, is so important, as even in games which I think are jaw-droppingly beautiful such as Spider-Man or God of War, there's undeniable moments where characters still look like robots being programmed to do certain things. It's a subtle but important aspect that I think more games should focus on, and this game most definitely aims for that fluidity which I crave for. Every item that's picked up, every hand gesture, even every movement of the face is portrayed in a staggering amount of detail which has to be admired to at least some degree. I notice elements like the camera's depth of field are used especially well during these cutscenes, being more akin to a type of animated film as opposed to a video game, but I suppose that movie element is really what they were going for, which is my only criticism of these. As captivating as these are, I don't think there was any need to shove this amount of film grain into these to the level which they do. I understand a gritty tone is what they're going for, and it's not so distracting to the point of being even remotely an issue. It's purely the fact that I want to take in as much as I possibly can here, and the film grain occasionally got in the way of this marveling. Onto the actual game's graphics. Aside from some technical issues which I'll focus on in a sec, this game looks so fantastic. It should be noted that I recorded all of my footage on the PC version with the graphics cranked up to the max, and although I had a few minor performance issues along the way, that is absolutely not the fault of the game. I think it's purely the fact my PC isn't what would be considered top of the line anymore. The game is clearly optimized incredibly well, and I was shocked that upon installing it, they've clearly managed to condense the borderline insane storage requirements of the previous game. It's still big, but with how detailed games are getting nowadays, it's becoming harder to fit these into what would previously be thought of as average sizes. Starting with the environments, during the campaign we're once again globetrotting, heading to a wide variety of locations that are all immaculately realised and stunning to look at. Even the opening, which was a wide open desert, is something to be admired in my opinion, with the lighting in particular being one of the IW engine's strongest strengths. Whether it be blisteringly sunny or incredibly dark, the lighting enhances these environments to an indescribable degree. Seeing your surroundings be lit up by gigantic explosions delivered by a nearby helicopter, with the destruction destruction and particle effects being another aspect which intensifies this game's realism. Just engages me in the experience like nothing else. Texture-wise, everything is both pristine, filthy, and a mess in the best way possible. With the Call of Duty games being so focused on weaponry, you can only assume that all of the weapons here are not just incredibly detailed, but hugely varied too. We'll see more of that when looking at the gunsmith system in the multiplayer section, but even in the campaign, there's such a wide variety of weapons to get our hands on, all of which look and function different in their own rights, with all of the weapons having a large amount of attachments and skins depending on what weapons you're given at the start of the mission, as well as the ones we can acquire off enemies along the way. Taking a closer look, which admittedly is very hard to do when you're constantly being hammered down by enemies, I once again can't help but marvel at the texture work here. These aren't just stock weapons that we're being given, every single one has a sense of age, with all different types of scratch marks and indentations we can see along them, and with a clear emphasis on water and rain during a couple of these. I can also tell they were very avid in showing off the different light sources that sheen off our weaponry when they've been in wet conditions. When it comes to the character models too, the detail in all of these, whether that be main characters or one of the many grunts we're mowing down throughout, there's such a diversity to both their appearances and the clothing they're wearing. I realised this only fairly recently, but I think the clothing of characters gets overlooked just a bit too often. Criticising a game for having similar looking models is a reasonable argument, but I'd say most of the time you aren't even getting the chance to get a close-up view of their faces anyway, at least not the enemies. Depending on the different types of enemies we're going up against, they're either wearing their standard military army clothes, which makes perfect sense, or more impressively, due to the fact we're in modern times, a large amount of the hostiles are simply wandering around in standard clothes, whether it be a puffer jacket and jeans or body armor and cargo pants. Clothing is such an important part in diversifying the characters, and they absolutely do that here. Excluding the enemies dressed up in full body armor, not once did I think throughout the game the enemies I was fighting looked even vaguely similar, and that is a grand feat which I think even the highest profile games struggle with. Putting in all these different variants is difficult and should definitely be appreciated when noticed. As for the main characters, they've been stuck in my mind ever since I saw them all. Characters like Price, Soap and Ghost are a given. They've all got their distinct characteristics, such as Price's mustache and boonie hat, Soap's mohawk, and of course Ghost's mask. But I was more amazed by characters like Laswell, Farah, and Alejandro, as on the surface, they basically look like standard army people. But I think with the frequent reoccurrences we see, on top of how well they get fleshed out here, makes them stand out far more than I was expecting. The character design is great, but looking to the effects, most of these are absolutely on point as well. Explosions are grand, just as they should be, always now leaving tons of smoke and debris flying into the air, something that with the much more destructible environments can just pull you into these firefights. Effects in relation to the guns are all brilliant too, as they should be after so long. Muzzle flashes off guns are fast and bright. The addition of being able to physically see our bullets accurately travelling through the air, an addition which I believe started in Black Ops 4, is great. And the blood effects are also good. Not great, I wouldn't point them out as being an aspect to be endlessly gazed at considering how low-key and naturalistic they are, but they serve their purpose. Ever since the brutality of games like World at War, I will forever be questioning why they stepped away from the dismemberment elements of taking out enemies, especially in a game like this, which is blatantly going for a dark tone. Even for someone like me, who doesn't particularly like gratuitous violence, having that extra element of completely ruining your enemy felt somewhat necessary to me. Bullet impacts are still all great, as I said. Blood bursts out of every enemy, and all your bullets are accurately reflected when shooting the environment. That's in both the case of concrete walls, which will shoot out smoke and debris, as well as the hundreds of objects scattered around, which will all realistically react, move, and topple over. And as we were focusing so much on the movement earlier, the animations are spectacularly realistic. The one which has been talked about the most are of course the weapon animations, and specifically the reload. There was even a full-blown video made specifically about them when 2019 came out, and the process is actually very interesting. The reason they're so great is because whereas a lot of games will use motion capture to make the animation process slightly easier, the animation team here chose to animate all the weapons by hand. This means that every gunshot, every shotgun pump, and every change of a magazine has been meticulously crafted with as much care and detail as humanly possible. It leads to this perfect in-between where these both feel immensely realistic on top of being heavily stylized, and I think the fact I've occasionally been tricked into thinking these were real life says enough in relation to how these animations are carried out. The other kinds of animations we're witnessing constantly are the friendly and enemy AI movement, which still have a certain degree of robotishness to them when we're out on the field, but what looks particularly good are certain moments that you can absolutely tell are mocapped. A lot of games do this at points, and to be honest, when thinking about it, I don't like this approach to a certain degree. I think it's likely the fact of it breaking a certain illusion once again. We're witnessing the characters act and react a certain way for a prolonged period, and then all of a sudden when breaching a door or fighting off someone in close combat, they have this much wider variety of animations. Small issue, I know, but one that I thought I'd bring up nonetheless. So yes, as you could obviously tell, I think the visuals here are utterly fantastic in almost every aspect. Although I will say, the few technical hitches I had along the way did substantially dampen certain environments for me at points, which, future update or not, I personally witnessed, so I felt the need to bring them up. They aren't truly severe, but noticeable. Things like textures appearing incredibly blurred, like they haven't loaded in in yet, or having shadows appear grainy no matter what anti-aliasing and shadow options I selected. They in no way drag the experience down, but they're there, so even if they do end up getting patched, I thought I should at least mention them. Kill or capture is the first real mission of the game, and just like we suspected, we're thrown straight into the deep end here. There's not many moments throughout this game where we end up fighting through areas that are thriving with civilians. For me, although it ends up making the experience tonally consistent, I did end up reminiscing on moments like Piccadilly from 2019 that were made so much more intense simply from the fact we were fighting in a highly populated area. That does eventually lead to a greater point, which I'll talk about in a sec, but for now let's stick with the mission. Like most of the operations we carry out here, we're usually approaching these first and foremost with covertness, which I very much liked. This mission to me is what I saw as a far more intense and grander version of the clean house scenario. We're not dealing with that same grey area where we're trying to identify who we should or shouldn't shoot, at least not for the main bulk of it, but the whole basis is revolved around going into a few houses to try and get hold of the main antagonist of the game, Hassan Ziani. This inevitably ends up being a failure, as we could assume, but what this mission does well is once again introducing the player to how things have changed since last time in a gameplay sense. This isn't the slow build-up that was presented in 2019. We get into numerous firefights from the get-go here, ranging from both long to close range. I've never really liked having hints and tips pop up on screen, especially in a game like this where they're constantly removing all the HUD elements to let you observe your environment in as much detail as possible. But I suppose with this basically being yet another introductory mission, it's not all that bad, with it reminding players to use some of their equipment like flashes and grenades. If the equipment's there and is genuinely effective in taking out enemies, I don't see any harm in giving the player a single reminder early on, while also accompanying it with a specific scenario which best shows off their utility. The moment where we hold off against a few waves of enemies is fantastic, having a gradual elevation of stakes on top of looking great with the surrounding fire and smoke. I'm not sure if it was intentional, but due to us holding out inside a crashed helicopter, it was also reminiscent of the mission's second son from the first MW2, although here of course we aren't lacking supplies and are in fact supplied with a bounty of them. This all ends off with a push towards a final house while getting shot at from the distance, giving us a nice chance to try out our long range skills with the sniper we were given at the start. I especially love how we get the red light green light approach in relation to the snipers which are shooting at us, witnessing their lasers target us and having to quickly jump down into the dirt to not get spotted. And then finally, when heading into a warehouse where we eventually discover an American missile, we're presented with arguably one of the most conflicting elements in the entire game for me. What I'm talking about are the armored enemies that we end up encountering very frequently, and I'm not entirely sure how to feel about them. On the surface, they appear like something which I would love, forcing the player to think more carefully in relation to their accuracy, their ammunition, and their positioning, due to the fact that reloading in front of one of these guys might as well be a death sentence. They're an inclusion that checks all the boxes, but simply not for what I perceive as a satisfying enemy in a COD game. It's something I haven't particularly identified up until this point, but there's always been this satisfying element of these games where enemies go down rapidly, and in a few of the games in an incredibly gory fashion to boot. While these brand new enemy types present a different kind of challenge, one that I'm not afraid to deny I may just not be accustomed to, I felt they break the flow of the gameplay just a bit too much for my liking, with the regular setting which I played on seeming more like the hardened and even veteran modes at points compared to previous games. As I said, I'm conflicted. It makes the player change their tactics, which is a positive, but the negative of how much damage they can take if you aren't landing all of your shots on their head is too big to ignore. I like the idea of having accuracy and positioning play a larger role. You can't rush through a lot of these sections like previously solely down to these guys, and I suppose overall I at least appreciate the attempt to switch up the gameplay in some proportion, but I think it could have been implemented without being such an occasional nuisance. With the American missile being discovered, we've not only got the risk of a large terrorist threat being on the loose, but as we discover, an even greater risk of having 2 of these 3 stolen missiles being launched on home soil. As a result, Price and Gaz continue the pursuit after Hassan in Amsterdam, taking us to Wetwork. This is a mission that, while visually stunning due to the surrounding city environment and especially the water effects, both above and below the sea level, I wasn't a fan of how the actual objectives presented. Although the open-ended approach a large amount of these levels take is usually effective, I felt this was a rather sloppy start to this trend. Your objective is all based around making your way to a barge through a large body of water, and the biggest issue I have is the restricted vision that this water brings. Unless a game's mechanics are all based around stealth, I think a lot of games struggle with the detection aspect these quiet moments bring, and especially FPS games. Some games like Far Cry go for the approach of having a detection meter pop up blatantly on screen, showing both how close you are to being spotted as well as where you're being looked at from. I've always found these external UI elements rather distracting from the experience, however. Much like my criticisms around waypoint markers, it actively takes your focus away from the actual game world, and instead makes you focus on these bars which are separate from it. They're useful, but in my eyes they're taking away from the experience. Here we get a bad in-between, as due to the immersion being such a key component, they've purposely stayed away from having those HUD elements on screen. Most of the time if you get spotted it's fine, as you'll be able to fight your way out of a tight situation, but here we only have a limited amount of ammo on our pistol, and are constantly being encouraged to perform underwater takedowns on the enemies. Again, it all sounds fine on the surface, but in execution I think think it could have been done slightly better. Emerging out of the water will almost immediately alert your target, which in turn alerts all of the surrounding enemies that are nearby. You could argue that due to us having a pistol on top of having some throwing knives, now you could deal with them that way instead. However, then we've got the issue of perspective, an extremely key component to stealth games. Games like Metal Gear Solid completely bypass this element by giving us a top-down view and a radar. We can quite literally gauge the enemy's movement and their field of vision perfectly, all the while not making the game too easy in the slightest. In that game, the task is once again revolved around when to pounce on your target, due to the other targets surrounding them. What I think this game should have done is take the approach the Batman games did, and perhaps have some kind of sixth sense detection mode. You could say I'm being too hard on it, and you might be right, but having every single target you take down be an absolute risk because you can't clearly visualize which other targets might spot you doing it just annoyed me. Paying attention to your environment is one thing, and I like how the light sources here are purposely placed in a way to illuminate the targets when they move from each individual spot, but having that extra layer of detection outside of the extremely subtle bar that pops up at the top of the screen would have been appreciated. And that's all we really do here. Take out as many enemies as we can without getting spotted, with the increased difficulty and lack of any substantial weaponry forcing the player at points to actively retreat and attempt to lose the enemies. You can still try deal with the enemies if you go loud, but you're taking a big risk if you actually do. They can wipe you out fast here. It's when we reach the barge that we discover the Las Almas cartel are actually working alongside Hassan, taking us into the mission Tradecraft. I love these kinds of levels where we're actively having to blend into our environment. They're not especially original and have basically been done to death in the COD franchise, but due to how you're constantly shooting throughout the entire campaign, they're always a nice change of pace. Although I enjoy the atmosphere here, being able to witness all the civilians getting on with their day, and being able to observe and actually enter some of the countless shops around, which look incredibly authentic. The objective itself is rather simplistic, and I put it down to the fact this isn't how most blending missions are carried out. Usually they're based on infiltrating some type of enemy base, getting dressed up in disguises and working your way through a facility, whereas here we're out in the public in broad daylight, so realistically we're trying to keep any acts of violence to a minimum. It's all based around identifying a particularly high value target who's got intelligence on Hassan, and taking him down, along the way using a syringe to knock out a few of the cartel scattered around to avoid drawing attention. This of course eventually goes south when the cartel notices us snatching the target, which led me to an interesting and rather tragic discovery. From the start, these remakes have continually forced the point that war is a grey area. We might be fighting what are known as terrorist threats, but there's a noticeable amount of effort given to the enemy's beliefs, as well as our own actions. Although we're fighting groups which are actively trying to cause a huge amount of destruction, we are in no way painted as the good guys. It's a good thing to convey in a game series that has consistently been labelled as pro-war, which I never think it has been. The gameplay might be violent and incredibly exciting to play, but especially in their campaigns, they're primarily trying to identify the horrors of war and presenting them in a way that is so grounded at points to where it may even become disturbing for some. That's most prominently shown off in the World War II games, of course, with those being fictional stories entirely based on actual events. It's funny the contrast we see here though. These last two games take a headfirst dive back into this debatably more risky approach of not painting these factions out as good and bad, but as I said, more of a grey area. This aspect is presented so blatantly though, to the point where it becomes almost annoying to me, and the biggest problem is that they don't go anywhere near far enough. So much so to the point where in this game we are basically being painted out as the good guys, due to how any type of civilian casualty getting caught in the crossfire is gone. 2019, while being even more obvious in this regard, with us having to sacrifice civilians at certain points to save our own skin for the greater good, at least had that element to make us question our actions. The point is though, although it's conveyed in the story, it's not reflected at all within the gameplay. I'm not entirely familiar with the guidelines developers have to adhere to while working on a project, but I'm almost definitely sure you are genuinely allowed to put this type of content in your games. It's just the fact they don't even attempt to include it here in a game sense. You can witness your teammates pulling off morally questionable actions, but getting into the actual game you've got this immense restriction where you can't deal any harm to anyone outside of your enemy. Doing so will greet you with an immediate fail state where you're told you either can't harm civilians or your teammates. Teammates I can understand, the main characters need to stay alive, and failing the player instead of just letting them fire rounds of ammo into them without having them get injured works for immersion. Civilians though can actually be killed. It's just the fact your action is instantly painted out as a wrong one. Clean House has a good example of this, where a woman would go pick up her baby, in which you could then actually shoot it. Even having a little Easter egg where if you shoot it 3 times in a row you'll get a message saying "Are you serious?" and a force back to the level select screen. That one moment sums up how scared these games are to include this type of content though. The devastating act of accidentally, or if you're very twisted, purposely shooting a toddler in the face can't even be seen. They cover it up. It's frustrating, as it fundamentally goes against what these games are clearly going for. Missions like Tradecraft and Piccadilly could have been used so effectively to convey this, that I have to assume somewhere along the pipeline they were simply told they couldn't include any type of non-hostile violence. In a game sense, this is still effective to some degree, having to check your shots more carefully as to not hit a civilian by accident. But I just feel the idea of seeing these people get shot down by your hand without this immediate fail state could have been far more impactful. Continuing the pursuit of Hassan leads us to the US-Mexico border, this time stepping in the shoes of Sergeant Major Rodolfo and following orders from Alejandro Vargas. I think that's an element I really enjoyed from this game. By decreasing the scope of these operations and usually carrying out our objectives in a fairly small team, I feel it not only makes all the actions we take feel even more impactful, but it also makes everything we do feel more important as a result. There's a place for the magnificent spectacles we saw in the army segments in the first Modern Warfare games, but in those instances, there's an undeniable and purposeful contrast to what we do when doing things with the SAS or Task Force 141. While fighting for the army, regardless of what title you're given and how effective a soldier you might be, you still feel like one of many other grunts that you see gunned down around you, while the SAS missions make you feel like a vital asset. If just one of you gets taken down, the mission could be an absolute failure. And ultimately, that's the general consensus for most of the missions here. They're high stakes, but played out in a low-key manner. Borderline is another great example of this, actually getting a visual on Hassan at the start of the mission, and having to track him down through a suburban area. This mission is brilliant from start to finish, doing a great job at showing our pretty much unwanted authority while forcing our way into people's houses and backyards. We've obviously got a job to do, but as a result are causing unrest to the people that we're trying to keep calm and safe. It's yet another example of how this game handles civilian casualties badly, with it still failing us even when certain people are trying to attack us by surprise with baseball bats and the like, but I won't talk about that aspect from here on out. There is one moment here which is subtle, but I found to be very impactful however, and it's exactly what I was looking for. One of the houses we enter presents us with two armed men, initially seeming rather dangerous until you consider the environment we're in. Due to us being in such a clearly run down and poverty-stricken area, it's almost a given the majority of people will be carrying some form of weaponry simply for protection. These two men, however, actively try to open fire on us. They're of course not informed about our mission, and having two heavily armed men bust into their house must seem like an extremely worrying threat. So, as a result, we need to take them down. We were backed into a position where it was do or die, and had to actively kill two innocents due to their dangerous reaction. We put the mission before the people, and no matter where you stand in relation to that, it definitely made me start questioning my actions after the fact. The escalation towards the end is also fantastic, capping the mission off with a literal bang when getting stopped by the local police. Much like the armed civilians we had to take down, it's making us perceive our actions through the eyes of your average person, and to the local police, our actions are apparently almost indistinguishable from a criminal, getting stopped and almost arrested before the sheriff informs the men that we're special forces. That in itself is brilliant. If it wasn't for this small amount of miscommunication, several lives could have been saved as a result.
Where's your suspect? Track them.
Entering the house, Hassan gets the jump on Rodolfo, both nearly killing him in the process and also letting him escape once again. Cartel protection sees Ghost and Soap meeting up with Alejandro in Mexico to once again try capture Hassan. This is where we start getting into more intense firefights, playing out over several distinct sections, ranging from some torn up slums to a river by the end of it. The majority of this level, I was marveling at the level design, something which I think was starting to get ignored during a few of the past COD games. They've always been well crafted, but there was a point where, much like the multiplayer levels, the way they were constructed boiled the player's options down to a very set way of progressing forward. Whether it be a lack of verticality or what I perceived as lazy enemy placement, there was something that I felt was lacking. Here from the get-go, we've got enemies bursting out of small structures, taking cover behind tables and walls, and the part I appreciate most, coming at the player from multiple angles. When initially making our way through the village, we get a taste of this with some of the enemies which are elevating themselves up on buildings. But when retreating into the forest, this verticality is used especially well from the enemies which are pouring out behind us. Enemy placement is such an important factor, as it keeps the player on their toes and makes them more closely observe their surroundings, and they do it perfectly here. Same goes for when we end up in the water, not only making a great spectacle when we get to observe the mountains while parkouring along a cliffside, but also the huge jump we need to make from these cliffs into the water below. This is when we get hounded by enemies from the land, having to take minimal cover behind the rocks while shooting at them from the water. The set piece is marvellous, all capped off with the gigantic destruction of the bridge ahead of us. The only concern here comes from a technical issue once again, with certain textures up close and also out in the distance looking rather blurry, almost like they aren't loaded in properly. I would have initially assumed this was a problem on my end, but after looking at other reviewers noting this same problem, I think these brief moments of bad texture work are an engine problem. It's nothing too major of course, as the game on the whole looks great, just once again something that should be noted. This takes us to what has become somewhat of a staple for the franchise at this point, and that's the AC-130 missions. It plays out about as you'd expect. You're giving aerial cover to your teammates below while having to carefully navigate your shots around them. The progression here was worryingly slow to start off with, but I think by the end of it, this may be one of my favourite versions of this setup in the franchise. There's a larger focus on observing our targets before engaging this time round, with there being numerous farmers around this complex which we can't open fire on. I will say though, that's my biggest issue here. Death from Above was a shocking mission, as it was the first time it had been done, but the impact is all still there for me when returning to it. The stark ambience of the plane's engines in the back and the nonchalance of the dialogue in relation to raining down hellfire on these targets was striking.
More enemy personnel. Yeah, direct hits right there. You got him. Whoa!
It was the fact everything felt so removed, which is what I think clicked with a lot of players. And despite that still being here, we've once again got a contrivance. No firing on non-hostiles and no destruction of any buildings which don't have to be destroyed. Looking at real life footage of these aerial assaults, it makes me realise it's the realism that was the key here. As during the period Modern Warfare came out, graphics were still far from being described as photorealistic. The thermal scopes hide the graphics and essentially replicate how these real life assaults will be carried out. Not with a constant concern over which targets we're hitting, but a worker's mindset of getting the job done no matter the cost. Looking back to the mission itself though, we're guiding Ghost Team into this complex to apprehend Hassan, starting off by taking out the countless hostiles that are on the ground level with a variety of weaponry. We've got the 25mm, which is the lightest piece of artillery here, which is a cannon holding up to 30 rounds at a time, being most effective for dealing with enemies on the ground. Then there's the 40mm holding 10 rounds, being more effective for any types of artillery or vehicles that are being brought in. And then the LTM, holding 1 round at a time and being a huge missile which will devastate anything in a fairly wide range. They all have their set purposes, and although the initial capture of Hassan only requires us to use the 25mm, it's the second part of the mission which becomes swiftly chaotic. Ghost Team gets rammed off the road when transporting Hassan out of the area, and have to wait for an exfil, which is where we go full guns blazing. The sheer destruction here is genuinely impressive, with every building we hit collapsing and falling apart depending on where we hit, and how much fire we're bringing down. It's especially structures like the gas station which of course present this chaos in the best way imaginable, with the resulting landscape eventually being completely filled with smoke and fire. There was also an extra little addition which I noticed here, where for the first time people on the ground will actively start targeting the airship with missiles. All we need to do is hit a button to send out flares and we're fine, but I still appreciate the effort to switch things up and perhaps throw some people off temporarily. The cutscene after this I especially liked, with the team realising the fact that due to Hassan being captured in Iran, he's not what could be considered a prisoner of war, but simply a hostage. But for some reason they play it by the books here and have to let Hassan loose. Back to Price, Gaz and Laswell, we end up tracking the second missile to a remote island off Spain, taking us to Recon by Fire, what I consider is the best mission in the game and one of the few incredibly ambitious moments which I was craving for. This operation's off the books, so ideally we're attempting to locate and seize this missile, causing as little attention as possible. And bringing back out the ghillie suits, that's exactly what we do. I love the little fake out moment at the beginning where it seems like these two hostiles dressed up in ghillie suits are Price and Gaz, before they get shot in the back by us.
Bravo, what do you have?
It's a great moment, while also letting us know the area we're about to enter is heavily guarded, and is actively prepared for the kind of attack we're about to pull. What I like about this one right off the bat is that compared to other moments in this game, which I just see as one-for-one replications of things that have been done before, this is what I see as being heavily inspired. It's of course got a similar atmosphere to All Ghillied Up, but the structure of the mission and the objective itself is vastly different. I'm happy this inspiration is still here though, as I think it does wonders when looking at how the mission is structured. We obviously start off slow, observing our environment, what type of artillery we're going up against, and attempting to locate where the missile's being transported to. Along the way, we have direct callbacks to moments from All Ghillied Up, such as having to stay completely still while an enemy patrol passes, with Price even directly quoting the lines which McTavish previously said.
Small patrol. Dead ahead.
Enemy patrols dead ahead.
If you have to maneuver, do it slow and steady.
If you have to maneuver, do it slow and steady.
It's the scale of this one which impressed me to no end, and moreover, the restraint they show in relation to the threats we deal with along the way. They don't overdo the encounters at all. They're all appropriately spaced out over the course of this huge field which we end up traversing, making every single combat scenario more memorable as a result, whereas other levels might blend together due to how much you're firing. And the next of these memorable encounters is when we stealthily take out all the hostiles on the outside of the main building. It's a combination of satisfying shooting and a sense of actual teamwork with Price that makes this great, with Price advising you on which targets you should take out at certain times, as well as informing you on how many notches your sniper scope should be aimed at. It's yet another instance where the openness of the level is used to maximum effect, with you having to swap positions a few times in order to line two of the enemies up so you can take them out simultaneously. This level also introduces two other mechanics, one of which is put to great effect in the future, and the other of which is so irrelevant and unutilized that I feel there was almost no point having it here. Starting with the backpack, we can now press 4 to bring up a menu where we can select a variety of equipment, both lethal and non-lethal, to help us out in our mission. The immersion this brings is already brilliant, with us now feeling realistically equipped for the type of mission we're going on. But in a practical sense, it just feels nice to have this selection of equipment to choose from whenever we want. And as we see when heading into this compound, it provides even more freedom in how to deal with certain situations. And what's even better is that the levels also adhere to this. For example, one of the warehouses we end up heading into gives us the option to either head in through a skylight and ambush the enemies from above, perhaps using some grenades and flashes to cause some immediate damage, or you could use a snake cam under one of the doors, survey the area inside, and then use a breaching charge to make an explosive introduction. Presenting freedom in a series that can feel direly restrictive at points is exactly the direction I was hoping a COD would eventually take, and it only gets better from here. The other mechanic I mentioned is the incredibly sparse dialogue options we're given. In this mission, we're given these during a brief moment of dialogue between Price and Laswell, and I can only assume that picking the separate dialogue options here must surely lead to even more moments of insight, as the ones I chose deepen the connection I had to both Price and Laswell, and I pretty much chose a throwaway set of options. It's a good start, but I was expecting this to get expanded, and hell, just used more in the future, but it doesn't really. There's one moment in a later mission where the dialogue options are put as center stage, and they are so lacking that I wish they just didn't use them. We'll talk about that when we get to it though. The rest of this mission consists of another long-ranged encounter, on top of bursting into another set of buildings and going underground before Laswell gets captured. The entire mission actually ends up being a failure, not being able to identify any missile and also losing Laswell in the process. A moment that I have to admit had near to no impact, even though I was starting to actually connect to our character at this point. This is where Shepard starts showing his true colours.
We can't just send in the cavalry. These things take planning and preparation.
These things take violence and timing. I can do both. Kate's life is in a fucking hourglass.
Which is also the moment where I start to get confused about the line between good and evil here. As although Shepard is basically telling us to leave Laswell for dead, something which will definitely happen if we don't track her down before she's taken underground. It's not an unplausible route to take, admittedly, and as someone who hasn't entirely attached to the character of Laswell at this point, due to the fact we've only seen her personality in bits and pieces, I really didn't mind either way if we were going to go save her or not. But in terms of mission variety, I'm so glad we do end up going after her, as it takes us to yet another mission absolutely filled with set pieces and another grand switch up to the gameplay, injecting elements from their Warzone game mode in a way that doesn't at all feel out of place. We're taken to Urzikstan, where we meet up with Farah from the previous game, a character that I've got to admit is brilliant due to several moments in 2019 where we get to witness her at her strongest and weakest points, the standout of which being when we have to control her as a child. We're still taking control of Gaz, shooting down from a helicopter being piloted by Nikolai, and once again I've got to say the feature I'm most impressed by here is the scale. The sheer length of this mission, both in terms of its running time and in terms of how much ground we cover, is magnificent. It doesn't feel confined in the slightest. I'd say it genuinely feels like even by the time we end up rescuing Laswell, there's still miles of desert to be explored. Simply by letting us traverse through a large area, the world building is being enhanced immensely. The initial firing down from the helicopter is still fairly engaging, but aside from the frequent missiles which start targeting us, which work effectively in testing our aim on moving targets, there's not much actual threat. This is switched up when we eventually get hit and fall out, having a close shave with death as we're caught by the rope, leading to us shooting upside down with our pistol. This is one of those classic COD moments where we enter the borderline insane territory. The realism's utterly gone in moments like this, and I can understand if some people get sick of this stuff, but I've got to admit, I don't think I will ever tire of these kind of set pieces. They're just too impressive visually, with our entire perspective being turned upside down, with numerous cars flying right past us. But admittedly, things get switched up in a gameplay sense as well, with us now having to shoot our targets with a larger amount of precision due to us not only being upside down, but also only having a pistol. If we got back into the helicopter after this and rescued Laswell, I think I still would have thought this was a good mission, but the best part is that it keeps going and only gets more ferociously intense heading forward. After cutting ourselves loose, we end up having to hijack a vehicle, leading to one grand chase down this highway. This was the Warzone element I was talking about, with the vehicles in that mode never controlling perfectly in my opinion, but fine enough for the circumstances that we've been currently placed in. My favourite part of this though is how we're allowed to lean out the window to continue firing on the enemies ahead of us, as well as being able to jump on the roof of our car and hijack another vehicle if our one's close to exploding. From what I saw, I also think there's a certain certain amount of driving assistance we're given when leaning out the window, something which I can actually appreciate, as although it'd be more realistic, I'm not sure including this lean feature in the single player mode would work that well if you were just to fall right off a cliff if you aren't paying close attention. They do the right thing in letting you focus more on your gunfire, and this is basically how the rest of the mission plays out, which was where I mainly realised the scale of this level. It's something that could have potentially felt drawn out, as it definitely goes on for longer than I was expecting, but because there's brand new threats along the way, such as enemies throwing mines and explosive drones at us, on top of a couple moments where we need to hop on the back of a truck with Price and use a grenade launcher, they managed to make this one intense and engaging from start to finish. Back to Ghost and Soap, they're focusing their attention on the Las Almas cartel, heading to a mansion which allegedly has some of the cartel's VIPs inside, the most important of which being El Sin Nombre, their unknown leader. The setup to this is rather insane, but the other characters react in the same manner, with Soap saying he'll waltz right up to the front door and exchange intel for Sin Nombre's identity, all in hopes of garnering the location of the remaining 2 missiles. This is another mission all about blending into our environment, but not before we're met with the characters Diego and Valeria.
¿Es este?
Which is the situation where we're questioned about who attacked the cartel's people and what characters like Graves want from them. As I said before, the dialogue options here are basically void. No matter what answers you give, there is only one right answer, and anything except that will lead to Valeria either asking again for clarification, or simply killing you due to your incessant lying. This is a mechanic that could have been put to much better use, and even had me questioning at the time if we may have some kind of branching paths akin to Black Ops 2. That is just not the reality here though, it plays out the same every single time. The rest of this one is yet another slow escalation before we capture Sin Nombre, eventually being revealed to be Valeria herself, an ex-teammate of Alejandro's. I do like how this level introduces us to the idea of distractions, however, being able to pick up bottles from around the environment which can be thrown to lead enemies to a certain area. Nothing innovative of course, but still an interesting inclusion in terms of the COD games. One thing I've got to be honest about after replaying the old Modern Warfare games is that although everything here is undeniably solid, I think both the story and general dialogue is an undeniable downgrade. I'm not sure where this has come from, but I keep having the feeling it's the realistic aspect which may potentially be dragging this side down. Just think back to the original trilogy. There is just so many memorable moments and even individual lines from tons of characters that I can list off the top of my head. Price always had the best quotes, of course.
What the hell kind of name is Soap, eh? How'd a muppet like you pass selection?
This is for the record. History is written by the victor.
Everything seemed to be so iconic, and I'm desperately trying not to look at this through any kind of rose-tinted goggles. But I think most people would also agree in my opinion. Throwing a knife in Shepard's eye, hanging Makarov at the top of a skyscraper, the entirety of the Chernobyl segment, the atmosphere of the original trilogy was so distinct, and I feel like that's somewhat missing here. You've got some nice banter between the characters, and I find it majorly impressive that a high-profile game released in this modern period didn't make me wince at any line that's delivered. It's just the fact that upon reflection, I think the first 3 campaigns were far and away a more concise and gripping narrative with an overarching story, something which I noticed was strangely missing from this one. Although it's called Modern Warfare 2, there aren't many links to 2019 outside of the returning characters. It's a completely different operation, a completely different target, and judging by the game's ending, it seems this is set to repeat for the 3rd game too. I would usually claim I'm jaded, but I've not only purposely tried to observe these games in the most objective manner possible, but I've also gone back and played through all of the previous trilogy right after playing this new one. It's not a criticism particularly, just something I noticed the previous games excelled with, whereas this game only satisfied me. It didn't blow me away in relation to its narrative and characters, and especially not the writing. I can't particularly quote anything from either of the 2 new games apart from the lines which are direct rips from the previous ones. Anyways, after interrogating Valeria, we get the location of the 2nd missile, taking us to an oil derrick located off the shore of Mexico. Now, this is an amazing looking mission. The rain and water effects here look truly amazing, but as many people have identified already, I have no idea why they chose to basically rip an entire mission's concept from a previous game. If you aren't aware, in the first MW2, the mission The Only Easy Day Was Yesterday had this exact same premise, infiltrating an oil rig and fighting your way through it. The layout here is of course different, but as I said at the start, the unoriginality is worryingly obvious. Remember, this is not a remake, it's a reboot. I understand liking certain ideas from the past, but from the outset, this really does just seem like the developers wanting to do one of their old concepts in a better way. And although I don't think I can judge if it's better or not, the mission we do get is still fantastic nonetheless. It seems like we're initially going to try stealth our way through with our dark clothing and silenced weaponry, but everything quickly escalates upon getting closer to the missile, or at least what we think is the missile. In the mission briefing, we're informed there's a nearby ship located by the oil rig, and after discovering the cargo container is empty, we naturally assume it must be on that ship. So that's right, we're not only getting a recreation of one mission, but we're also getting a recreation of Crew Expendable 2. I in no way think I'm being too critical here, mainly because of how much I enjoy the overall experience. Much like the rest of the experience experience like the gameplay and graphics, I think they should be pushing the series forward, not regressing to ideas they've already attempted before. Compared to the first part, however, which wasn't substantial enough to leave any kind of impact, I loved this segment on the ship, which is primarily down to the frequently moving cargo containers and crates on the deck. I thought the physics looked fantastic with how they swayed around with such weight, and the additional risk of both not having reliable cover while at the same time having to actively avoid being crushed by these things was thrilling. And to cap things off, we get this initially unique moment where we need to input certain buttons into the missile's controls to detonate it. It's already in its burning phase, so disarming it is no longer an option. And although it's nothing too special, any change of pace from the shooting, even a little moment like this when we need to recite the correct information to Graves, serves as a fun little interlude. And not to mention the ending, firing the missile directly into the oil rig and marveling at our handiwork.
Saw the way.
Look at that big man.
The ending cutscene, however, presents a twist that, while I didn't see coming, was never off the cards with anyone we've been interacting with. It's a thought I in fact had in relation to Alejandro. Graves ends up stepping out of line and taking Alejandro's base from him, resulting in tensions rising before he eventually ends up opening fire on us, injuring Soap in the process and taking us to yet another very interesting mission. It reminds me of a far more fleshed out version of what we saw at the end of the mission The Hornet's Nest, being left in a dazed state with no weaponry to use. This means that stealth in this one is mandatory. If you aren't avoiding the upcoming threats, you'll be wiped out straight away. This is a nice switch up, if a bit of a restrictive one, but works well when seeing how the mission's carried out. I'll admit, I think while being a good way to firmly set Graves as a new antagonist, witnessing him rounding up and killing the locals, this sudden power trip, while not being unplausible, is very sudden. I mean, he only just betrayed us, and now he's gone into full-blown masochist mode. Even from his gleeful celebration during his introduction in the AC-130 mission, it's clear he's a sadistic individual.
Hook, line, and fucking sinker. That's what I'm talking about, Shadows. You know I love that shit!
So it's less of a character problem and more just an abrupt switch that gets flipped, with that being something which made me both laugh and appreciative towards the subtitles, with his subs turning red halfway through a conversation showing that he's now identified as an enemy. It's over the course of this one where the backpack's functionality is used to its maximum potential, not being used for equipment this time, but now being turned both into storage for crafting parts we collect along the way, as well as a crafting menu. These range all the way from ropes and metal to chemicals and mousetraps, letting us craft some DIY devices like pry tools and smoke bombs to survive. I just thought this addition was brilliant, grounding us in this dire scenario by scraping up anything we possibly can, and also giving us a brand new way to tackle these encounters. We do eventually end up getting our hands on some very limited weaponry like a basic knife, but once again it's all based around if you manage to scavenge supplies beforehand, as this knife in particular is only able to be located if the player is exploring the level to its maximum potential, meaning that likely they'll need to start using their equipment more effectively to get past. Nearby is also a safe, which reminded me of the ones in The Last of Us Part 2, making us observe our surroundings more closely to be able to input the correct combination. These only show up a few times in the game, but I appreciated them nonetheless. Anything that's encouraging the player to stop for a second and take in the finely crafted atmosphere is a win in my book. It's in this level where the distractions and environment itself is also put to great use, where outside of the DIY equipment, we also have the return of bottles for distracting enemies. It made me realise as well how great the addition of opening doors was, something which I can only assume was possible due to the increase in technology. Not literally the idea of opening a door, but having these actually lead to somewhere, whereas in earlier games everything seems so blocked off. Here we can enter several kinds of shops and houses to garner even more supplies. This rule applies to most of the levels here, and where exploring them in those instances might not be as rewarding and essential as in this mission, they typically end up giving the player either an increased amount of cover or an alternate path forward. I see it as fairly simplistic. There's lots of games that have already used these types of interiors in spades, but for Call of Duty it ends up broadening the levels and making them feel more expansive, regardless of how big the area you're actually exploring is. The progression of this one is the standout feature, working your way out of what initially seemed like an utterly hopeless situation, and then by using your wit, slowly acquiring weaponry that increases in lethality. When getting our hands on a gun, we can also notice Soap has a large degree of shakiness while aiming down sights, and I love when the actions which are presented in the story are actively reflected in the gameplay, only being able to steady his aim for a brief period before it starts wobbling again. Funny enough, even though I wasn't a huge fan of Advanced Warfare in general, I thought the section in Captured, where you only have use of one arm, was brilliant in a gameplay sense, removing your ability to reload and requiring you to pick up other enemies' weapons to get your ammo back. Anyways, we eventually end up rendezvousing with Ghost and getting out barely alive, where in the following cutscene they yet again replicate another idea from Modern Warfare 2, that being an us versus them mentality, with Ghost claiming that anyone outside of their group is now considered a hostile.
Ghost waited for me.
Of course, no?
No.
Yes. We're a team. All of us. This happened on my watch and I'll need help to fix it.
No one fights alone.
This takes us to Prison Break, with our mission now being to rescue Alejandro from the prison Graves has him locked up in. Well stocked and prepared, we head into what seems like yet another suicide mission, quietly making our way into this heavily secured prison. Everything goes about as you'd expect to begin with, your usual silent takedowns and timed eliminations, up until we reach a surveillance room where we need to guide Ghost through an area tightly filled with enemies. This is what I mean about developing ideas and not solely copying them, as one of the standout moments during 2019 was the moment where we do what's basically exactly this, but with a civilian inside an office space. This first version was rather simplistic, just leading her from point to point and having to cause one distraction along the way, but it was still gripping. Here, the possibilities have been expanded, as well as the length of the section in general, to create an even more fleshed out version of this concept. We're still guiding Ghost from point to point, not being able to freely move him, but instead select a range of preset places we can move him to. But now we're dealing with someone that's competent in combat. We now have the option of taking out enemies too, an idea which is taught to the player slowly over time by starting off with only a few sole guards, before they start getting more intense. We need to lead him to 4 separate vehicles to place explosives for a trap later in the mission. And overall, it's just another great moment where thinking 2 steps ahead and carefully planning out when to move and attack will get you through. In terms of how we've perceived Ghost's character in the game, I'm not sure he'd go down as easily as he does here if we end up failing, but without that risk, we literally wouldn't have any stakes, so I give it a major pass in that regard. By the time we end up reaching Alejandro, the prison ends up going on full alert, having to shoot our way out through these tight prison hallways and recreational areas. It was this mission in particular where the difficulty really started to noticeably ramp up, with tons of shotgun-bearing armored enemies that can literally kill you within the blink of an eye. I've heard some people describe this as a difficulty spike, but that implies the difficulty was different up to this point, which it wasn't. It's just the fact that more intense weaponry is being thrown at us, which I don't have an issue with at all. My favourite enemy in this one, of course, being the men carrying riot shields, still being a daunting force due to the fact you won't be able to get a significant amount of damage off when attacking from the front, and forcing the player to either get up close and flank round them, or to utilise some of their explosives. This time working even better due to the fact that attaching something like a Semtex to the front of their shield will lead to them trying to get it off and exploding in the process. It's Price and Gads which eventually come to give us backup, with that being an idea earlier in the mission which is used just as effectively, releasing the rest of Alejandro's allies from their cells and arming them to fight off the enemy forces. This is where we end up joining up with Price, with our final 2 proper missions being Ghost Team and Countdown, wiping out all the threats which have come up against us and finally dealing with a missile crisis. I say proper missions as there's one in between called Hindsight, where similar to the coup from Modern Warfare, we're simply sat in the back of a truck as the events play out around us. It does present another moment where we need to lean out of the truck to kill the enemies which end up ambushing us, but the mission's too short to be seen as substantial in any way, and ultimately could have just been reduced to a cutscene explaining that Graves and Shepard's main flaw is about their pride in relation to a failed mission. The Ghost Team's now fully cut ties with Shepard, with Price sending out a full-blown threat to the man, with Shepard's name now appropriately being presented in red.
This is your last chance to change your mind.
Then what?
Then after I go for him, I'm coming for you.
This opening cutscene to the mission Ghost Team is brilliant, giving us the slightest reveal of Ghost's actual face and solidifying the team's bond by all donning ghost masks. I love that kind of visual storytelling, and in this instance I'd say it's definitely deserved. Because of how they've acted towards each other throughout the game, you can really feel their bond to each other. The opening to this one is great as well, going full James Bond and having to dodge in between a number of laser beams before disarming them. As I mentioned, it's the return of restraint which makes these work, and for a game like this, I understand that it's a risk. You've got a gun in your hand and the main point is to shoot it. So adding these more interesting environmental challenges and, to be honest, borderline platforming sections may not be to everyone's liking or expectations. In execution, I think it works well though. Another thing I like about this one is the switching perspectives that we see here, cutting back and forth between the characters Soap and Gaz to see every stage of this operation with our own eyes. The whole premise of this one is the most blatant example of how this game eventually ends up being less about the terrorist threats and more about our team. If we were playing by the rules, we would have no need to go back and reclaim Alejandro's base from Graves, but because of our dislike towards Graves' character by this point and our connection to Alejandro, it doesn't seem like an out of place scenario at all. This one's about as explosive as you could imagine though, getting into tons of firefights as we journey deeper into the base, while at the same time being given aerial support from Price, who's piloting an attack chopper. The bit which interested me the most, however, is the final encounter against Graves, shooting at us from a tank. These games have primarily stayed away from the idea of boss fights, and for good reason in my opinion. Everything else here is basically presenting the fragility of these soldiers. No matter who they are, they can go down in a hitch if they're not being careful. And although I appreciate the attempt, I did unfortunately think the boss fight here was far too clunky and inconsistent in how it's carried out. I don't mind the approach of attaching C4 to the tank to take it down. It might be repetitive, but it works well enough. My only issue would be in relation to Graves' attacks from this tank, as they're incredibly damaging and also have the strange effect of travelling through walls basically. Again, I understand he's in a tank, one shot from the thing would utterly destroy anyone in close proximity, but in a game sense, being killed from a shot that we literally had no concept of gauging can be slightly frustrating. This would be things like getting destroyed from behind a wall or on the other side of a building. It makes sense, but was slightly confusing at points as I quite literally didn't know where I was getting killed from. And for as much flack I could throw at this fairly clunky encounter, I still think it's something that stands out during a campaign that can find itself blending together at points. The dialogue shared between Soap and Graves does make this feel like an ultimate showdown, and I was genuinely surprised at how gratifying taking down Graves actually felt. I've got a feeling that as the years go on, these are going to be characters that I actually remember, unlike the countless ones from games like Advanced Warfare and Ghosts, which I've almost completely forgotten. Countdown is the final mission we have here, set up with the fact the final missile is located in Chicago, a gigantic threat which was only revealed later to us by Valeria before we had to set her loose. I already enjoy this prospect, as due to the way the dialogue's carried out, it makes me assume that in the inevitable Modern Warfare 3, she may end up making a comeback, being an overarching threat that's set up over the course of multiple games. And like that, we head to Chicago, landing on top of this huge skyscraper and having to rappel our way down the building. I love this initial opening. It's not only fun to take out these unaware targets on the side of a building, but the visuals we can get over the city landscape quite literally makes us feel like an ant in comparison. And of course I enjoy that feeling, as intentional or not, it puts everyone's actions into perspective, with humans being the only possible creature on Earth with the ability to start never-ending wars and nuclear weapons, all fighting amongst each other to decide who's the most powerful. I will say though, comparing it to the other games, I can't help but feel the ending here is slightly lackluster. We carry out the mission the same way we pretty much always do, neutralizing as many enemy threats as we can, while at the same time having to locate the missile controls and perform yet another controlled explosion. The return of the crafting in that section is good, but as we're in such a small area, I found they were actually less necessary, considering we can play a cat and mouse game with the enemies and survive just as well. And to be honest, if there was one thing I was hoping they took influence from, it's the final showdown from the original MW2. That moment was not only led up to with an utterly insane boat chase, but the iconography of Soap slowly pulling the knife out of his chest before throwing it in Shepard's eye is undeniably distinct. It's bordering goofy and is definitely a full-on power trip, but it's still great in its own right. There's a poignancy in how we take out Hassan and then just end it there. It goes back to that another day in the office mentality, but everything surrounding this goes against that. The stakes are constantly being set up to look as grand as possible. We're not army grunts, we're established special forces with defined personalities, so I feel like there should have at least been a bit more here than just popping Hassan in the head. When everything's said and done though, we end the game off with yet another meeting between Price and Laswell, just like 2019, establishing the threat for what I assume is the final part in this brand new trilogy, and bringing back what I'd say is the series' best villain, Makarov, even getting a post-credit scene where the titular "No Russian" phrase is shown off in all its glory, making me even more excited for what I assume will be another 3-year-long wait to wrap up this story. And that's the campaign, every single level and scenario I could talk about in depth, and overall I think it's fantastic. Yes, there's bits and pieces that could have been improved, but for a series that has strayed further and further away from having a satisfying narrative, this knocks it out of the park and brings some genuine innovation to the franchise. But of course, a lot of people don't buy brand new COD games for the campaign anymore. We can judge that immediately by stats like the achievements, with the figure of how many people got to the end becoming increasingly smaller with every new entry. Funny enough, I think the approach of releasing the campaign early was incredibly clever, as I noticeably witnessed more people playing through it simply because they were craving any new early content from this game. So I think it's time to move our gaze to the multiplayer and co-op modes, with Spec Ops also making a return, just barely. And of course, during this time we'll focus more on elements like the weapons, sound, gunplay, and also just if this other content is up to par with what we saw in the campaign. Starting with the multiplayer, I'd say the differences in how these matches are carried out are fairly minimal when comparing it to 2019, for one big reason, and that's the gunplay. We didn't just see a substantial change in the visuals due to this new engine, but the gunplay was switched up in a way that fans both praised and despised. I remember it initially being compared to the Battlefield games, but I don't think it goes that far into this more tactical war zone. It still has the incredibly fast-paced action the COD games have always been known for, just with an emphasis on a more considered and slow approach than before. The main thing I pointed out immediately when playing 2019 for the first time was the recoil and the time to kill. You go down incredibly fast in these games, and I think that has a lot to do with the player's accuracy here. It's a constant test in relation to how effectively you can get shots off while battling the weapon's recoil. The Gunsmith makes a return, now being known as Gunsmith 2.0, where we can customize tons of different aspects of our weapons and add separate attachments to improve elements like the weapon's range, damage output, and accuracy. I fret to talk about the balance of the weapons here, as COD games nowadays roll out hundreds of minor updates constantly to deal with these frequent balance issues, and that only makes me question why they can never seem to get it right. It's an issue that goes all the way back to COD 4 and World at War, with weapons weapons like the MP40. What they've done in relation to your progression this time round though I found to be brilliant, only really towards the weapons however. Your overall progression in terms of leveling up I thought was very slow. I don't think my memory's foggy either. I definitely remember leveling up much faster in previous games than we do here, which is a slight concern. It just reeks of forcing players to sink hours and hours into the multiplayer, a problem that wouldn't be too bad if we at least had a slight amount more variety of maps and modes here. The weapon progression however is great, as it now forces players to use a wider variety of weaponry to either unlock new attachments or brand new weapons. The M4 was the best example of this for me. Once you get up to level 20 you would have been given access to a brand new LMG and battle rifle, where in turn you need to level those up to a certain point before you're given access to the M16 and Hurricane. I think it's great not just in terms of pushing players out of their comfort zone and experimenting with weapons they may have otherwise stayed away from, but at least in the opening hours it restricts the player from grinding with a singular weapon and unlocking everything there is for it, perhaps minimizing the idea of broken or overused weapons to a certain degree. After that point's gone and all the attachments are unlocked, I'm sure it's a different story, but overall I think this approach to weapon progression is one that I hope returns in the future. The amount of attachments we can pick from is majorly impressive, all having their individual pros and cons nicely laid out beside them in the menus. For me though, there's only one stat I'm always looking to improve, and that's the recoil, something that you can either focus on or stray away from with the brand new weapon tuning system. No matter how you look at it, every weapon here is deadly in at least some proportion, and for someone like me who primarily uses assault rifles, all you're wanting is that pinpoint accuracy. The further away you are from a target, the harder it is to hit them. That's a given no matter what game. But here it can become especially difficult with how intensely some weapons thrash around. It's not only harder to hit them, but actually harder to see them as well. I do have to say though, unlike others who feel these elements take away from the action, I think it's just a new approach that at some point you'll end up becoming accustomed to. There's a real weightiness to everything here. Sprinting around all the time can frequently lead to you getting killed depending on aspects like how fast you can draw your weapon and aim down your sights, with snipers in particular having a fairly large window where you're waiting to get a proper view of your scope. Taking out enemies will always be satisfying to me though. It's that classic hit marker and feedback sound, on top of knowing you've actually killed another player that is somewhat equal to you compared to an AI, that brings this competitive rush. It can be hit or miss depending on who's on your team, who you're fighting against and what map you're playing on, but when you get a good match, it gives us that fast-paced and exciting experience that the COD series has always been so good at. Looking to the different game modes, we've got 10 to start off with, only 2 of those being brand new. Prisoner Rescue is just a COD version of CSGO basically. Depending on what team you're on, there's 2 targets that you need to either capture or protect, with winning a round resulting from either the capture of these targets or wiping the enemy team. Knockout is also fairly similar, but removing the element of the targets and simply making the mode all revolved around holding a package, while at the same time having the ability to revive your teammates. These are both good, and same goes for all the pre-existing modes we have here, like your classic TDM and Domination, but I do feel these are lacking in some proportion. Even though I'm almost positive they'll be added over time, I don't even understand why they couldn't at least bring back modes like Gunfight or Infected to begin with. They may be more specialised to certain players, but they're fun nonetheless. Same goes for the maps as well. I really don't care about future updates here. I paid £60 for a game, and the promise of stuff in the future will always sound like an excuse to me, no matter if they've already got stuff planned or not. And the map selection here is very hit or miss, and I don't think I can confidently say there was any map here that I noted down as being particularly well designed or even memorable in a visual sense. Well, apart from one, that being the Santa Sena border crossing, going down as easily one of my least favourite COD maps in a very long time. I can appreciate what they've tried to do here, creating a map that's basically 2 straight lanes and having the entire map packed with broken down cars that we can use as cover. But that's exactly why it's awful. It's incredibly cluttered, meaning that you can be picked off from locations you literally can't see, while at the same time just being a nuisance to get round. The 2 modes that I spent most time having fun in were the ground war and invasion modes, both having 5 wide maps to battle on, all of which feature the maps from the smaller modes within them. It's not what I'd call the classic COD experience, but it's a damn exciting one when you get into the right match. COD's never been a franchise where you can organise your team to target certain points at certain times, and with 32 players on each team, that's basically an impossibility. But I found it so fun to either take out enemies and take over objectives in ground war, or simply to go all out and wipe out as many enemies as I can playing invasion. Ground war is exactly as it was before, having to take control of several objectives over a large map to get your points up, basically a large-scale domination. And following that idea, invasion is just a large-scale TDM, with every kill giving you a certain amount of points that get added to your team's score, ranging from 5 points when killing a player, all the way down to 1 point when taking out one of the many AI-controlled enemies. An addition that makes this mode feel even more grand than it already is. I didn't have an issue with really any of the large-scale maps here, as they don't feel barren in the slightest. It's not like Warzone where you can find yourself just wandering around for ages. There's a noticeable amount of detail and a surprising amount of power positions in maps that could have relied on their scale alone. And before we take a look at the rest of the other maps, I just want to give a moment of appreciation to the sound design, as it's just as good as it's always been with these games. First off, every single gun, and I mean every single one, sounds great. The bite, snap and punch, depending on what type you're using, always sounds appropriate, and audibly lets you know how much chaos you're causing by pulling that trigger. Talking about ambience here might as well be pointless when considering how loud and cluttered the multiplayer matches get, but taking a look back to the campaign, during missions like Wet Work, Tradecraft and Dark Water, you get these fantastically crafted soundtracks, perfectly reflecting the situations you're being put in. And as for the music, it's all fine here, with this new emphasis on bassy drones and strings the majority of the time. But I'll be honest, I miss when you were able to identify the themes to these COD games, with the original Modern Warfare theme arguably being the most distinct in that regard. Explosions are grand, nearby helicopters sound massive. The sound those bomb-dropping planes give off is the only thing to have genuinely freaked me out in a game for a while. It's just great stuff all across the board, and there's clearly been a lot of effort put towards the sound in general. Back to the maps, I've got to be honest and say this initial selection didn't satisfy me all that much. There's far too many maps I find to be either unnecessarily convoluted, or too many that seem underdeveloped. That's most blatant with the highway map, but even looking to maps like Tarak, Alasilo, and Hydroelectric, they seem to be lacking something both in terms of their structure and appearance. Tarak is just an utterly destroyed village, and relies once again primarily on the numerous structures scattered around. Looking at the map from a top-down view makes you realize how messy this actually is. I understand people were getting sick of the 3-lane structure, believe me, I was too, but Jesus Christ, replacing that with no structure to speak of just led to me getting lost at points, as well as not realizing where enemies can attack from, something that happened even more because of how bad the spawning still is. I'm not sure why they can't get this right now. It's something I definitely remember was a big complaint at the start of 2019, and due to most maps being on a larger scale in general, it's annoying that their only way of handling these bad spawns currently, where you can get picked off within a few seconds of spawning in, is to just push you back even further, meaning more running and less action per game. My favourite maps here are ones like the Breenberg Hotel, Farm 18, Embassy, and Mercado Las Almas, and I don't think it's a coincidence all of those have far more defined structures. Farm 18's your classic 3-lane map when you break it down, but has well done interiors like the firing range in the middle of the map, and plenty of elevated power points scattered around that can lead to a fair amount of kills, but only if you're being spatially aware. The roof you can jump on at one end of the map gives you a good visual on each of the 3 ways the enemy could push from on the ground, but you can just as easily be taken out at the opposite side of the map if you aren't paying attention. Breenberg, despite all the rage I've had in relation to just being bad, might be my overall favourite here, unlike other maps which made me occasionally get frustrated due to the incessant camping, which I once again have to say is an approach that's now far more encouraged. I felt in this one there was a great balance. I always felt that I could tackle those kinds of players and that any mistakes were my own, not the map's design. On the whole, the multiplayer this time round is basically more of what people asked for from 2019. Yes, I think it's lacking in content right now, and I do see that as a criticism even when removing the inevitable future updates, but taking that into account in a positive light, I only think this multiplayer can get even better from a foundation that I personally found to be very solid. And to wrap things up, let's take another dive into the underdeveloped and pretty much pointless inclusion at this time, the Spec Ops missions. Now, 2019's initial Spec Ops experience was a complete embarrassment. It was buggy, broken, and utterly lacking anything substantial. They added to it over time, eventually presenting a range of large-scale operations and individual missions that, while I saw as being quite fun at points, ended up being insanely difficult, which, if I remember correctly, was a response to people saying they were way too easy. Honestly, if you didn't have a solid team that you can communicate with in those, you were almost destined to fail. We've got 3 to choose from here, but admittedly I did think they were much better than what we saw in 2019, and could have been even better if I was playing with an actual friend. That's because missions like Low Profile and Denied Area pretty much call for that, being all focused around stealthing your way forward and potentially punishing the players quite severely if they don't. Going from house to house and collecting the radioactive objects in Low Profile made me realise why I've always enjoyed Spec Ops, going all the way back to the first MW2, and that's because you're in full control. You're given the objective and are completely let loose to tackle it in a way that you see fit. It may not have all the set pieces and extremity of the campaign, at least not for now, but that leadership idea can in turn make these feel like an even more personal and individualized experience. They're simplistic objectives, but that's all I think they really need to be. We can see in the past operations that going on for too long can just lead to frustration at points. One thing I did feel the absence of, arguably only because of the mission Defender, was the lack of a survival mode. Thank God they didn't do that console exclusive thing again, and due to this one being labelled as a subcategory, I imagine we'll see even more of the survival based Defender missions in the future, but I still would have liked to see it. This Defender one is the mission I arguably had most fun in too, coordinating with my random teammate about what points we should individually defend at, while also being able to access a buy station to get hold of equipment like cruise missiles, additional reinforcements, and even a Juggernaut suit, which I was not expecting would be accompanied with some hardcore metal music. Spec Ops in its current state is barren, just like it was last time. So my review now is good start, but we need more, which we obviously will get in the near future with the upcoming Warzone 2.0, and the rumoured Tarkov type mode, which sounds incredibly ambitious and exciting. Looking at the game overall though, coming off Vanguard, it's an incredible return to form. The campaign, while not being as impactful to me as 2019's, is definitely going for something much more ambitious, and in turn brings the personality of the Modern Warfare series to the centerfold again, with the characters, cutscenes, and combat scenarios being the best part for me. The multiplayer in Spec Ops can be dodgy in certain aspects, but I think the overall quality of everything and the classic COD gameplay shines through to make me feel like I genuinely got my money's worth. A high bar to exceed, considering that games are now incredibly expensive, and even with games I've enjoyed, I sometimes still feel the prices are a tad too much. On the outside, as always, people who aren't fans of these games will label it as just another Call of Duty game, but for a series that's managed to treat its incredibly loyal fanbase like absolute dirt at points, Infinity Ward has definitely proven themselves to go all out as of late. They're trying to deliver an experience that could potentially rival the obvious Game of the Year contenders. And with Modern Warfare 2, I think they succeed in this effort. It's a game that I've thoroughly enjoyed for the most part during its opening run, and if things keep up this way in the future, I intend to keep playing the immensely engaging multiplayer as new content gets released over the following year. It might not stack up to what I've experienced in the past, but these Call of Duty games that are being made for a brand new generation of gamers are utter quality, admittedly depending on who's making them. The gunplay's always stellar, the graphics are always great. The only thing I feel is dragging them down genuinely is this brand new model in which they release them. Overall though, fantastic stuff all round, and I wait anxiously for what awaits us in the future.